Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, I want you to imagine spending 40 years building an absolute empire. I mean, you hold all the power, all the wealth, all the influence.
Right, you're at the absolute peak.
Exactly. And then, in a single 10-minute conversation, you just burn the entire thing to the ground, you permanently destroy your family, you plunge your whole world into chaos, and it's all because one person refused to tell you how brilliant you are.
It's terrifying, but that's the reality of a fragile ego.
It really is. Today, we are stepping into a text that is, well, it's frankly monumental. We're using a 400-year-old masterpiece to dissect exactly why powerful people sabotage themselves. We're looking at William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of King Lear, but we are pairing it with the brilliant, penetrating commentary of the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt.
Which is such a fantastic pairing.
Yeah, it really unlocks the text. Our mission today is to use this massive, tempestuous text as a mirror for our own lives. We are looking squarely at the fragility of the human ego, the terrifying consequences of avoiding the truth, and ultimately the incredible resilience of the human spirit.
And setting the stage for you, the listener, is just crucial here. We are treating this deep dive as a high-stakes masterclass. You are not just a passive audience member watching actors on a stage. You're a participant dissecting human nature, the illusions of power, and, well, the terrifying beauty of vulnerability.
I love that phrase, terrifying beauty.
Yeah, and Hazlitt himself pointed out that passing this play over is almost impossible because it strikes its root deepest into the human heart. It forces us to confront the mechanisms of our own minds. Like, why do we crave validation? Why do we hide from reality? And what happens when the structures we build to protect our egos finally just collapse?
So the catalyst for this entire collapse happens right in the very first scene. Act 1, scene first. We have Lear, this aging king, and he decides he's going to step down. He plans to divide his kingdom into 3 parts for his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. Before he hands over the real estate, he demands this massive public performance. He requires his daughters to stand in front of the entire court and declare who loves him the most. He is literally holding their inheritance hostage in exchange for flattery.
And the psychology of this demand is just fascinating when you look at the exact wording. Lear explicitly states his goal. He says he wants to retain, quote, the name and all the addition to a king. But he is giving up the actual responsibilities, the sway, revenue, execution of the rest.
Wow.
Yeah, he wants to shake all cares and business from his age, conferring them on younger strengths while he crawls unburdened toward death. He basically wants the identity without the utility.
Right. Lear is the ultimate prototype of a modern CEO or, a family patriarch who refuses to actually let go.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a founder who built a massive company. He's been in charge for decades. He announces his retirement, but he demands to keep the corner office. He expects everyone to stand and applaud when he occasionally wanders into the boardroom.
He wants the corporate jet.
Right. He wants the jet, the title, the prestige, and the endless stream of yes men telling him he's a genius. But he wants absolutely none of the late nights, the operational stress, or the hard decisions.
He wants to extract all the dopamine of leadership without generating any of the value.
Yes, exactly.
And that dopamine mechanism is exactly what is driving Lear's behavior. When you are in a position of absolute power for a long time, the brain's reward centers become deeply conditioned to deference and agreement. Hazlitt captures this perfectly. He describes Lear's character in this moment as defined by his rash haste, his violent impetuosity, his blindness to everything but the dictates of his passions.
Blindness, that's a great word for it.
Right. Lear has completely insulated himself in a reality built entirely on flattery. Over years of being a monarch, his brain has basically lost the elasticity required to process friction or disagreement. He has constructed this feedback loop where the only acceptable input is his own reflection, just magnified by the people around him.
And the 2 older daughters, Goneril and Regan, they understand that feedback loop perfectly. They recognize that this isn't a conversation, it's a transaction. So they deliver these sweeping, grotesque speeches. They say they love him more than eyesight, space, and liberty.
They lay it on incredibly thick.
They give him the absolute extreme of performative sycophancy. But then Lear turns to his youngest, his favorite, Cordelia. He fully expects the grand finale of flattery. And Cordelia drops the most dangerous word in the English language into the middle of this ego-driven performance.
She says nothing.
Nothing. The silence that must follow that word in the court has to be deafening.
Oh, Lear is completely short-circuited. He says, Nothing will come of nothing, speak again. I mean, his brain literally cannot process the data it is receiving because it completely violates his constructed reality. And Cordelia just calmly replies that she loves him, according to my bond. No more, nor less.
It's a total refusal to play the game. She is basically saying, I am your daughter, I love you as a daughter should, but I am not going to turn my genuine affection into cheap currency to buy a piece of land.
Which completely exposes the profound, terrifying fragility of Lear's ego. If we look at the underlying mechanics of identity here, Lear has built his entire sense of self on the shifting sands of other people's praise.
Yeah.
He hasn't built it on the bedrock of objective truth or actual connection or internal self-worth. When your identity is entirely outsourced to the applause of the crowd, the slightest breeze of reality will shatter your world.
It's a house of cards.
Exactly. Lear's tragic flaw is a profound, willful ignorance of reality. He has demanded a world where everyone lies to him just to keep his ego safe. When Cordelia introduces objective truth into that highly pressurized artificial environment, it causes an explosive decompression.
And he immediately disowns her. He strips her of her titles, her dowry, and banishes her from the kingdom. He just throws away the only person who actually loves him because her honesty threatened his vanity.
Truth is perceived as a violent attack by an ego that survives on flattery. And to understand the scale of this reaction, we really have to look at the broader historical and human context of the world Lear inhabits.
Right, this isn't modern times.
No, this is an absolute monarchy. We are not talking about a modern democracy where a leader with a fragile ego can just be voted out of office or criticized in the press. The king's word is literal law. He has the absolute power of life and death over every single person in that room.
Which makes speaking up incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. The social dynamics of a court like this operate under extreme evolutionary pressure. In an environment where displeasing the king can result in your execution, telling the truth isn't just a social faux pas, it is a mortal risk. It is treason.
That context makes the characters who do choose to tell the truth infinitely more complex. We have Goneril and Regan, who weaponize flattery to gain power, which, is the standard survival strategy in a dictatorship. But Shakespeare gives us two characters who act as the ultimate foils to that toxic culture, the Earl of Kent and the Fool. Let's look at Kent first. Kent is the guy everyone desperately needs in their inner circle, but very few people have the stomach to actually keep around.
Oh, Kent is amazing. He embodies the concept of dangerous loyalty. His loyalty is to the king's true self, to the institution of the kingdom, and to objective reality, not to the king's fragile ego. When Lear explodes at Cordelia and banishes her, Kent doesn't shrink back. He steps directly into the line of fire. He puts his own life and status on the line, stepping between a furious absolute monarch and his target. Kent says, "Be Kent unmannerly when Lear is mad." He tells Lear right to his face, "To plainness honor's bound when majesty falls to folly." He is actively trying to interrupt the king's self-destruction. When majesty falls to folly, he is looking the most powerful man in the world in the eye and calling him a fool. And Lear's response is the ultimate toxic boss maneuver. He tells Kent, "Come not between the dragon and his wrath," and then banishes him under threat of death. He fundamentally declares, "If you challenge my perception of reality, I will destroy you."
That reaction brings us straight to the psychological concept of cognitive dissonance.
Oh, explain that a bit more.
So, when an individual holds a core belief about themselves, in Lear's case, the belief that he is infinitely wise, perfectly just, and universally adored, and they are confronted with undeniable evidence that contradicts that belief, it creates immense psychological pain.
It hurts to be wrong. Exactly. The brain is wired to resolve that friction as quickly as possible. The hardest way to resolve it is to change the core belief, to admit, I'm acting like a fool and making a terrible mistake. That requires massive humility and self-awareness.
Which Lear does not have.
Right. So the easiest, fastest way to eliminate the pain of cognitive dissonance is to eliminate the source of the contradictory information. You banish Kent. You promote Goneril. You actively curate an echo chamber where your delusions are treated as facts.
Which leaves Lear with a completely sanitized sycophantic court with one massive exception: the Fool. The official court jester is basically the only person left in Lear's orbit who is allowed to puncture the bubble of his delusion.
And the historical function of the court fool is a brilliant psychological safety valve. Hazlitt's commentary on the fool in this play is incredibly sharp. He notes that the fool's well-timed levity comes in to break the continuity of feeling when it can no longer be borne.
That's a great way to put it.
Because as the play progresses, Lear starts to realize that Goneril and Regan lied to him. They strip away his knights, they disrespect him, they lock him out. As Lear's mind begins to crack under the weight of this betrayal, the tension becomes unbearable. The fool steps in, packaging brutal truths inside riddles and jokes.
It's the only way the truth can bypass Lear's ego defenses. If the fool delivered the truth directly, like Kent did, he'd just be executed. But because he packages it in absurdity, he creates a loophole. The ego can dismiss it as a joke, even while the subconscious absorbs the reality. The fool will look at Lear and say things like, "Thou hast little wit, and thy bald crown will now give thy golden one away." He is openly mocking the king for giving his power to his greedy daughters, acting as the only anchor to reality as Lear spirals into madness.
And Hazlitt argues that this doesn't just provide comic relief, it actually carries the pathos to the highest pitch. The fool highlights the pitiable weakness of the old king. The humor isn't a distraction from the tragedy. It is the mechanism that allows the audience, and Lear himself, to endure the tragedy without completely disassociating.
You know, the dynamic of the fool in Kent makes me think about how we structure our own lives. I mean, we might not be absolute monarchs, but we all curate our inner circles. We naturally gravitate toward the Gonerils and Regans in our lives, the people who validate our bad decisions, who tell us we were right to yell at that coworker, who assure us that our flaws are actually strengths. And we systematically avoid the Kents. We push away the people who love us enough to say, "You are making a massive mistake."
We avoid them because their honesty demands our growth, and growth is inherently painful. It is much easier to exist in a state of suspended animation, surrounded by people who demand nothing of us but our continued complacency.
Yeah, that desire for complacency, that desperate need to protect the ego from the consequences of its own actions, it brings us to a subplot in the play that feels incredibly modern. We have to look at the Earl of Gloucester and his two sons, Edgar and Edmund. Gloucester is essentially a parallel to Lear. He also gets completely manipulated by the toxic child and banishes the loyal child. But it's the way the characters process this chaos that provides one of the most chilling and relevant insights in the entire text.
You're referring to Edmund's soliloquy on what he calls the excellent foppery of the world.
Exactly. Let's break down the mechanism of what's happening here. Gloucester has just been tricked by his illegitimate son Edmund into believing that his legitimate son Edgar is plotting to murder him. Gloucester's world is turned upside down, his family is shattered. But instead of looking at his own gullibility or the toxic dynamic he fostered in his house, Gloucester looks up at the sky. He literally blames astrology.
Right, the stars.
Yeah, he points to these late eclipses in the sun and moon and says that the universe is out of order, nature is chaotic, and that is why his life is falling apart. He completely externalizes the blame.
And Edmund, who orchestrated the entire betrayal, is left alone on stage after his father exits. And Edmund delivers a speech that completely deconstructs human accountability. He mocks his father's reliance on the stars. He says, "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeit of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion."
Villains on necessity. Fools by heavenly compulsion. I mean, that phrase is a masterclass in human psychology. Edmund is exposing the ultimate defense mechanism.
He really is. Hazlitt was profoundly struck by this passage. He notes a deep appreciation for Edmund's religious honesty in this specific regard. Now, to be clear, Edmund is a sociopath.
Right, he's a terrible person.
He is a villain who destroys his family for power. But Hazlitt points out that Edmund refuses to pretend he's a victim of circumstance. He writes himself down a plain villain. He takes absolute chilling ownership of his own agency. He says, "I should have been that I am, had the maidenliest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing." He completely rejects the Elizabethan idea that planetary alignment forced his hand.
The mechanism Edmund is mocking is what psychologists today would call an external locus of control, this belief that your life is dictated by outside forces. And while we might look back at Shakespeare's audience and laugh at them for blaming literal eclipses, we do the exact same thing today.
We do.
We have just replaced the celestial bodies with new, modern constellations of blame.
We have simply updated the vocabulary of our evasion.
We absolutely have. Instead of blaming the sun and the moon, we blame the algorithm. We say, the social media algorithm made me so angry today, that's why I snapped at my kids. Or we weaponize pop psychology. I can't help that I'm toxic in relationships. I have an avoidant attachment style. Or we blame our Myers-Briggs type, our zodiac sign, our genetics, or the macroeconomic climate. We are constantly searching for a modern, heavenly compulsion to excuse our earthly behavior. We desperately want to be villains on necessity, because if our toxicity is necessary, we are absolved of the guilt of our own actions.
And this text forces a brutal confrontation with the listener. It strips away the comforting illusion that you are a passive leaf blown about by the winds of circumstance, trauma, or data sets. It demands radical agency. If you are sick in fortune, if your career is stalling, if your marriage is failing, if you are constantly surrounded by drama, the text asks you to consider that this might be the surfeit of your own behavior.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It is. Edmund's terrifying honesty is the trait we are meant to learn from, even as we are completely repulsed by his actions. It is a demand to stop outsourcing your accountability to the universe.
Because when you stop outsourcing your accountability, you are forced to look at your actual daily operations.
Yeah.
How do you govern your own life? How do you treat the people around you? And this is where we have to translate these massive 400-year-old theatrical themes into the reality of the listener's Tuesday morning. If Lear's tragedy is born from a demand for performative flattery and a refusal to hear the truth, how do we ensure we aren't building the exact same fragile kingdom in our own homes or offices?
Right. The application of this wisdom requires an audit of your environment and your internal demands. The first area of application is examining the space between what you expect from people and what you are willing to give. Think back to Lear's opening demand. He wanted the name and all the addition of a king without the execution of the rest.
The title without the sweat.
Precisely. You have to look at the roles you occupy. Are you a manager, a parent, a senior partner, a community leader? Where are you demanding the respect, the deference, and the authority of that title, while secretly neglecting the actual grinding responsibility that justifies it?
That's such a good question.
Are you expecting your team to treat you like a visionary leader when you haven't provided clear guidance in 6 months? Are you demanding absolute obedience from your children while refusing to do the hard work of emotional connection? If you are holding on to the crown but refusing to carry the weight, you are setting the stage for a collapse.
You are creating a structural vulnerability in your own life.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability is usually masked by the people around us. Which brings us to the second massive application of this text. If you want to avoid Lear's fate, you have to look very closely at your inner circle. We talked about the Earl of Kent, the man who risked his life to tell the king he was acting like a fool. You have to ask yourself right now, who is the Kent in your life?
And that is not a rhetorical question. It requires a specific name. Who in your life has the explicit, unrevoked permission to look you in the eye and tell you that you are making a massive, destructive mistake?
And the more power you accumulate, the harder it is to find that person. If you're the boss, if you sign the paychecks, if you are the undisputed head of the family, the gravitational pull of your environment will naturally push the Kents away and pull the Gonerills closer. People will naturally start to flatter you because it's safer.
Which means you have to actively design friction into your life. If you realize you don't have a Kent, if everyone in your inner circle just nods and tells you your ideas are brilliant, you are already living in Lear's echo chamber. And more importantly, you have to analyze your own historical reaction to friction. When someone has brought you an uncomfortable truth in the past, did you listen? Or did you banish them? Did you get defensive, freeze them out, or fire them? The mechanism of survival here is consciously accepting unvarnished, quiet reality over loud, performative flattery.
It's learning to value the nothing. When Cordelia said nothing, she was offering Lear the most profound, stable love in the world, a love based on truth, not transaction. But Lear's ego was too loud to hear the quiet reality of it. We have to train ourselves to hear the nothing in our own lives, to appreciate the quiet, steady people who don't applaud our every move, but who will actually stand by us when the storm hits.
But the reality is, training ourselves to accept that quiet, unvarnished truth is deeply uncomfortable, and that discomfort is the primary obstacle to growth. We resist the Kents in our lives, we cling to our modern astrology, and we demand the applause because facing the consequences of our own ego is terrifying. In fact, historically, society found the consequences in King Lear so unbearable that they actually banded together and erased them.
Okay, this is one of the most mind-blowing pieces of literary history I have ever encountered. When you read Hazlitt's commentary, he references the essayist Charles Lamb, and they discuss a period in history where the version of King Lear that we are discussing today essentially did not exist for the public.
It's wild. For roughly 150 years, from 1681 until 1838, the version of King Lear performed on the English stage was an adaptation by a playwright named Nahum Tate. And Nahum Tate decided that Shakespeare's ending was simply too sad. The original ending, where Lear's mind breaks, Cordelia is murdered, and Lear dies of a broken heart holding her body, was deemed too offensive to the sensibilities of the audience. So Tate rewrote it. He gave it a happy ending.
A happy ending to the greatest tragedy ever written. It fundamentally breaks the entire mechanism of the play.
Oh, completely. In Tate's version, Lear survives and is restored to the throne. Cordelia doesn't die. She actually falls in love with and marries Edgar, the good son of Gloucester. The villains are punished, the good guys are rewarded, and everyone lives happily ever after.
That's insane.
And this wasn't just some fringe production. This was the standard text for over a century. Even Samuel Johnson, one of the greatest literary critics in English history, defended Tate's happy ending. Johnson argued that the original ending was so shocking and painful that he couldn't even bear to read the final scenes. The audience demanded that virtue be rewarded and vice be punished in a neat, clean package.
They demanded catharsis without consequence. And honestly, we cannot judge them for that because modern culture operates on the exact same psychological demand. Look at the self-help industry. Look at toxic positivity. We are obsessed with the idea that every problem is just a setup for a comeback, that every failure can be hacked, reversed, and optimized. We want the Tate ending for our own lives. We want to believe that if we act like Lear, if we blow up our families with our ego, if we banish the truth tellers, we can just go to therapy for a few weeks, issue a public apology, and get our kingdom back.
We want the slate wiped clean. But this is where Hazlitt and Charles Lamb make a vital philosophical intervention. They argue vehemently against the happy ending and, by extension, against our modern desire to erase consequences. They argue that once you set certain destructive forces in motion, the landscape is permanently altered. Lear, as he says in the play, has wrenched the frame of nature from its fixed place. He has shattered the foundational bonds of trust and reality. You cannot put that back together with a neat bow.
Lamb's argument in Hazlitt's text is absolutely devastating. He points out that after Lear has been driven mad, after he was won to the heath in a thunderstorm, after he has experienced the total annihilation of his identity, the idea of handing him back his crown is a joke.
Yeah, Lamb writes that a happy ending for Lear is a childish proposition. What would the gilt robes of a king mean to a man who has been stripped down to his bare soul? After such a living martyrdom, the restoration of his political power is irrelevant. The value of the true tragic ending is the profound acceptance that some mistakes cannot be undone. You don't get to go back to Act I. You don't get to unsay the words that destroyed your marriage. You don't get to unmake the decisions that bankrupted your company.
Growth doesn't come from magically undoing the storm. Growth comes from surviving it and being permanently transformed by the fact that you survived it. It is the acceptance of living in the ruins of your own making, but living there with newfound clarity.
That is the hard truth of the text. However, as we extract this wisdom, we must also exercise discernment. We are praising the necessity of truth and condemning the fragility of the ego. But we cannot blindly idolize the characters who deliver that truth without examining their methods. And this brings us back to Cordelia.
Yeah, I want to push hard on Cordelia for a moment, because we've set her up as the hero of truth. She refused to flatter Lear. She said nothing. She held on to her integrity. But as I read the scene, I keep asking myself, did she have to be so brutal about it? If you look at the family system's dynamic, her father is an old man, clearly slipping, surrounded by vipers, begging for public validation. Was her bluntness entirely a virtue, or did her radical honesty actually act as the spark that blew up the powder keg?
That is an incredibly astute pushback, and it aligns perfectly with Hazlitt's own nuanced reading of the character. We often make the mistake of assuming that because a character's underlying motive is pure, their execution is flawless. Hazlitt does not make that mistake. He offers a very discerning critique of Cordelia. He notes that while her love and integrity are real, her response has a little of her father's obstinacy in it.
Her father's obstinacy. So she inherited the Lear stubbornness. Yeah. She is just as rigid in her truth as he is in his vanity.
Precisely. Let's look at the mechanism of her decision. She watches her older sisters, Goneril and Regan, deliver these dripping, fake monologues. Cordelia is disgusted by their hypocrisy. So, out of a sense of intense, rigid pride, she deliberately swings the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme. She refuses to play the game even slightly. She refuses to offer her father any public grace to save his face. Her integrity is absolute, but she weaponizes it. She prioritizes her own moral purity over the practical reality of managing her father's fragile psychology in a high-stakes public setting.
It fundamentally changes how I view the scene. It forces us to distinguish between the enduring wisdom of the text, which is that truth is vital, and the flawed application of that wisdom by the character. You can value radical honesty without using it as a blunt instrument to humiliate someone in public.
Right. The takeaway for the listener is about the delivery mechanism of truth. If your goal is actually to help someone, to be a true Kent or a true Cordelia to the people in your life, you have to think about how that truth can be received. You can be 100% factually correct and still be entirely unhelpful if your delivery guarantees the other person's ego defenses will immediately slam shut. Cordelia was right, her sisters were lying, and her love was genuine. But her pride in being right, her refusal to soften the blow with tact, ensured that her truth would not be heard. Truth requires empathy to be effective.
And empathy is exactly what Lear is entirely lacking in Act 1, which makes the progression of the play so devastating. Because the universe forces him to learn empathy in the most brutal way imaginable. We have to move into the sequence that defines this play, and perhaps defines Shakespeare's entire canon, Act 3, The Storm on the Heath.
This is the crucible of the play. Lear has been stripped of his power. He gave his kingdom to Goneril and Regan, and once they had the power, they immediately turned on him. They stripped away his retinue of knights, they locked the doors of their castles, and they cast the 80-year-old king out into the wilderness during a massive apocalyptic thunderstorm.
It is the ultimate manifestation of hitting rock bottom. He is wandering in the dark, the wind is howling, the rain is freezing, and he is screaming at the sky. Blow winds and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow. It is a scene of absolute chaos. But the physical storm is just a macrocosm of what is happening inside his brain.
The literal tempest is a mirror for the psychological tempest. Every single anchor Lear had to reality has been violently severed. His identity as a king is gone. His belief in his daughter's love is gone. His illusion of control is obliterated. Hazlitt provides one of the most beautiful analogies for Lear's psychological state in this moment. Hazlitt says Lear's mind is like a tall ship driven about by the winds, buffeted by the furious waves, but that still rides above the storm, having its anchor fixed in the bottom of the sea. His mind is staggering under the weight of this catastrophic betrayal, pitching violently back and forth, but he doesn't completely sink.
He's losing his sanity, but in the process of losing his sanity, he is finally finding his humanity. I mean, if for his entire life he was insulated. If he was cold, someone brought him a fire. If he was hungry, someone brought him a feast. He had no concept of vulnerability. But now, stripped of all his addition, standing freezing in the mud, something foundational shifts in his brain.
We see the birth of genuine empathy. If you connect this to broader human wisdom traditions, you see this pattern repeated across cultures and philosophies. It is the concept of the dark night of the soul, or ego death. In many traditions, profound enlightenment or connection can only occur after the false self, the ego built on titles and flattery, is completely dismantled by suffering. In the middle of the storm, Lear looks around and sees his fool freezing in the rain. He sees Edgar, who is disguised as a naked, mad beggar. And for the first time in his 80 years of life, Lear stops thinking about himself.
He delivers this speech that just tears your heart out. He says, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this."
Oh, I have taken too little care of this. It is an admission of ultimate failure, not just as a king, but as a human being. The pain of the storm has forced the expansion of his soul. The stripping away of his ego was the absolute prerequisite for his empathy. He had to become a poor naked wretch to understand that the world is full of them.
Which brings us to a massive philosophical question, and it's the point Hazlitt uses to conclude his essay. Why do we read this? Why do we voluntarily subject ourselves to watching an old man lose his mind, realize his mistakes too late, and die in agony? Why didn't we just stick with Nahum Tate's happy ending?
Because the tragic ending serves a vital evolutionary and psychological purpose. Hazlitt argues that witnessing this kind of profound tragedy is necessary for the human soul. He says that the greatness of the evil excites our sense and desire of the opposite good.
Witnessing the darkness forces us to crave the light.
Exactly. When you engage with suffering on this massive archetypal scale, it recalibrates your own internal metric of reality. It washes away our petty concerns. When you watch Lear's heart shatter on the heath, suddenly the minor inconveniences of your daily life, the rude email, the traffic jam, the slight bruise to your professional ego, they lose their grip on your psyche.
It shrinks our own narcissism.
It shrinks our narcissism and radically expands our capacity for compassion. Tragedy connects us to our deeper shared human affections. It is a brutal, uncompromising reminder of how incredibly fragile we all are. We are all just one storm away from the heath. And because we are all so vulnerable, it highlights how desperately we need to be kind to one another. The tragedy doesn't leave us in despair. It leaves us in a state of profound, empathetic clarity.
That clarity is the ultimate gift of the text. So I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as you step back into your own life. Think about the storms you have faced. Think about those moments when the bottom completely dropped out. The moments when you were stripped of your titles, your comforts, your echo chambers, and your illusions about who you thought you were. We spend so much energy trying to avoid those storms, or trying to hack our way out of them to get back to a happy ending. But what if those storms were not punishments? What if they were the exact mechanism required to wake you up? What if the storm is the only force powerful enough to wash away the excellent foppery of your life, to shatter the fragile ego you built, and to leave you with the unvarnished, empathetic truth of who you truly are?
That's something we all need to sit with.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.